moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the vast expanse of Blackwood Forest. The thick canopy of gnarled trees swayed in the wind, their skeletal branches clawing at the heavens. Deep within the woods, an unnatural silence had settled, as if the very air was holding its breath. For years, locals had whispered of strange occurrences in Blackwood, disappearances, unexplainable noises, and shadowy figures lurking just beyond the trees. Few who entered the forest at night ever returned, and those who did were never the same. Some spoke in hushed voices about an ancient curse, something evil that dwelled within. Others claimed the forest itself was alive, hungry for souls. Jake, a paranormal investigator with a penchant for debunking myths, arrived in the nearby town determined to uncover the truth. He had heard the stories, the warnings, but he was convinced they were just folklore. He had explored countless supposedly haunted locations before, and none had shaken him. This would be no different. Equipped with his camera, flashlight, and audio recorder, Jake ventured into Blackwood Forest just as the last traces of daylight faded. The path ahead was barely visible, shrouded in mist that coiled around the trees like ghostly tendrils. Each step felt heavier, as if the earth itself resisted his presence. The deeper he went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping insects, rustling leaves, were absent. Instead, a low, almost imperceptible hum filled the air, vibrating in his bones. His breath formed clouds in the chilling air, though it was supposed to be a warm night. As he walked further, his flashlight flickered, struggling against the darkness. He tapped it, muttering under his breath, but then froze. A whisper, faint, distant, yet unmistakable. He swung his light in the direction of the sound, but the trees stood motionless, their bark dark as coal. He shook off the unease and continued forward, filming as he went. "Just my imagination," he murmured, "or maybe the wind." But there was no wind. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like multiple voices overlapping. The words were garbled, unintelligible, yet they sent ice down his spine. Then something moved in his peripheral vision. A shadow, darting between the trees. He turned quickly, but the forest was empty. His breath hitched. "All right," he whispered to himself, "let's see if we can get some real evidence." He pulled out his audio recorder and pressed record. "If anyone is here, can you give me a sign?" His voice trembled slightly. Silence. He waited, ears straining. Then a crunch, a footstep, not his. Jake swung around, flashlight shaking. "Who's there?" he called out. The beam of light revealed something. No, someone standing just beyond the trees. A woman, barely visible, her face obscured by the darkness. Her dress was old-fashioned, tattered, blending with the mist that curled around her ankles. "Ma'am?" Jake called hesitantly. She didn't move. His heart pounded as he lifted his camera. He zoomed in, trying to focus, but just as the lens adjusted, she was gone. No movement, no sound, just gone. Jake swallowed hard, his pulse thundering in his ears. He turned back to the path, moving faster now. But the whispering had returned, louder, swirling around him. The voices sounded urgent, desperate. They weren't warning him to leave, they were pleading. Then, the forest changed. The path he had followed was gone. The trees had shifted, closing in around him like prison bars. The mist thickened, swallowing the light of his flashlight. Panic surged through him. He tried retracing his steps, but no matter which direction he turned, the trees looked the same. His breathing quickened. "Okay, don't panic," he muttered, though terror coiled around his throat. Then a sound unlike any he had ever heard, a deep, guttural growl, ancient and inhuman. It reverberated through the air, shaking the ground beneath him. He turned sharply and saw them, figures emerging from the mist, dozens of them, pale and lifeless, eyes hollow and staring. Their mouths moved in silent screams, but their voices formed the whispers that had plagued him. They weren't the threat, they were the victims. And then he saw it. A towering shadow, its form shifting, its eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. The whispers turned into shrieks as the entity reached for him, its elongated fingers stretching, the forest itself bending to its will. Jake ran. Branches clawed at his skin, roots seemed to rise to trip him, but he didn't stop. His flashlight flickered wildly, the shadows twisting unnaturally. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to escape. Then, a break in the trees, a faint light. With the last of his strength, he stumbled toward it, bursting through the tree line and collapsing onto the cold, dewy grass. He gasped for air, his body shaking. The whispers ceased. The presence was gone. He turned back toward the forest, but Blackwood was still and silent, as if nothing had happened. Jake never spoke of what he saw that night. He left town the next morning, deleting every piece of footage, every recording. But no matter how far he traveled, he would always hear them. The whispers, the warnings, and the voice that called his name in the dark. Jake tried to convince himself it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and paranoia. But deep down, he knew the truth. Blackwood Forest wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was something worse. For weeks after his escape, he suffered from nightmares. Each time he found himself back in the forest, running endlessly through an ever-shifting maze of trees. The shadow loomed behind him, whispering his name in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. Each time he woke, drenched in sweat, the whispers would linger in his ears, as if something had followed him out. His hands shook when he tried to edit his footage, but he couldn't bring himself to watch it. He hit delete without hesitation, but even as the files disappeared, he had the unsettling feeling that he wasn't erasing anything, that whatever had been recorded was still there, hidden in the depths of his hard drive, waiting. One evening, as he sat in his dimly lit apartment, his phone vibrated on the table, a notification from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it. There was no message, just an audio file. A deep dread settled in his stomach as he pressed play. At first there was silence, then the unmistakable rustling of leaves, the whispering voices. They were louder now, frantic, desperate, but this time he could understand them. "You shouldn't have left." Jake's breath hitched. His pulse pounded in his ears as a final sound crackled through the speaker. Low, guttural breathing. Not human, not animal, something ancient, something watching. The phone slipped from his trembling fingers, and he scrambled to turn it off, but the whispers didn't stop. They filled the room, rising in volume, surrounding him. The lights flickered violently and the temperature dropped. Then, the power cut out. Darkness swallowed the apartment, and in that darkness, he was no longer alone. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, stretching toward him, growing taller, its presence suffocating. The air felt thick, as if something was pressing down on him. He tried to move, to scream, but his body wouldn't respond. A voice, low and rasping, filled the silence. "You left the forest, but the forest never left you." The last thing Jake saw was the flickering reflection of two burning eyes in his blackened TV screen. And then everything went cold. Jake was never seen again. His apartment remained untouched for weeks before authorities finally forced their way in. They found his phone on the floor, screen cracked, still playing the eerie, whispering voices on a loop. His camera sat on his desk, untouched. But when the police reviewed the footage, they found something that hadn't been there before. In the final seconds of the last recording, the camera had captured Jake standing in the middle of Blackwood Forest. The timestamp showed it had been filmed the night he disappeared. But there was one horrifying detail. Jake hadn't been holding the camera. Something else had been filming him. And just before the footage cut to static, the whispers returned. "You shouldn't have left." "Oh,